Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Bishop Gambit, which is one of the more common lines in the King's Gambit accepted line, and that is e4, e5, f4 here, giving up pawn material here on the f4 square, and then bishop to c4. Now the most common line in the King's Gambit is knight to f3. This is my favorite opening in chess, but bishop to c4 is also a very good opening line from white. Now a lot of times players aren't playing this because they don't like the fact that the queen can immediately come here to h4, forcing the king to f1. White's not going to be able to castle on the king side, and they usually like to castle, bring their rook here to f1, and then use their rook in the attack, specifically on this semi-open f file. The main difference in the Bishop Gambit compared to the normal King's Gambit accepted line with knight here to f3 is the bishop is going to be doing all the attacking instead of this rook from h1. So if you're a player that likes the King's Gambit, but you also like to attack with your bishop, this is going to be a good variation for you. So we're going to be going over the main lines that you'll see. One is if the queen comes here to h4. Also, if you see knight to f6 or knight to c6, or if you see something like d6 opening up for the light square bishop to get involved. We're going to be going over all of those variations in the Bishop's Gambit. The first variation that we're going to look at is if the queen comes down here to h4, king to f1, but just know that eventually white's going to play knight to f3. That is going to force this black queen here on h4 to move. White really wants to get as much material involved into the game and control the center with the pawns as quickly as possible, and just let black have to worry about having no center control, no minor pieces really involved into the game, and their queen's going to be being chased all over the board. You typically don't want to have your pieces move around a lot, especially in the beginning of the game, and you usually don't want to have your queen just hanging out here on the h-file if it has nothing else to attack. So yes, white does have a king here on f1 that's not doing too much, blocking off the rook on h1, but white definitely has a lot of attacking lines in this. Now, depending on what black does, you're typically not going to see d5 because usually the queen is back here on d8 protecting that, because now you can just snag that with your bishop right here. But you could see d6 opening up for the light square bishop to get involved into the game. But as we talked about, knight to f3, forcing the queen back. Queen really has three options. It could come to h5, come here to h6. It can't come to g5, it would get captured by the knight here, or it could come back to f6. e7 doesn't make a lot of sense, blocking off the dark square bishop and then coming back to d8. Why even bring the queen out if you're going to just bring it back to d8? So you could come up, or you could see h6 here. In this case, you're going to play d4. Again, controlling the center of the board, opening up for more material to get involved into the game. Bishop takes on f4 at some points, protected by the queen right now, but you will be able to get this material back. White typically does not stay down in material very long. Knight to c3, really trying to control the center of the board. Now, once you play this d4, let's say they play c6. Okay, c3 here makes a lot of sense. If they play knight to f6, at this point, because d4 is here, we can start to push forward with e5. If they take here, do not recapture with your pawn. It may look good and say, okay, yeah, this is pretty good. I'm attacking the knight right here. But once they come down here to h5, actually, they can protect this pawn, and this is a pretty good setup on the king side of the board. And then how does white really continue? It's going to be better for white's perspective if they take with their knight here on e5, because this threatens the attack here on f7. And it's very, very difficult for black to hold on and control this king side of the board without giving something up. Really, the only option they have is to play bishop to e6, and then the bishop can take here, the pawn takes here, and then queen to f3. Now both the queen and the bishop are attacking the pawn. The queen is attacking this pawn here on b7, which is no longer defended by the light square bishop. So this is going to be a very good variation for white. Now the next variation you may see instead of the queen coming to h6 is queen to h5. White's going to, same game plan, d4 here. Now this pawn on f4 is no longer protected, so white's going to have an easier job taking this material back and have very, very aggressive bishops in the center of the board. Now if you see knight to c6, same thing as before, knight to c3 here. One slight thing to keep in mind is if they play g5, they could just go all out on the king side of the board here. Then knight to d5 is difficult to deal with. One, if white ever wanted to, has both the knight and the bishop attacking this pawn right here. So he could just have an exchange and blow up the king side of the board. But also it's now threatening this pawn here on c7, which would be a fork to the king and the rook here. So something else that's going to be very difficult for black to have to deal with. If they instead play, instead of knight to c6, they could come up here and play knight to f6. Same thing, you're going to play c3, knight to c3. Main difference here is if they play g5, then you're going to push forward with e5, attacking the knights right here. Again, if they exchange, you can bring your knight up here. That's going to be good for white. If instead they say, yeah, I don't want to bring my knight involved, maybe I just want to play g5. From here, white's going to play h4, a little bit different, not getting your knight involved. You need to counterattack right away. And then if they push forward with g4, then you have the nice move of knight to g5. It has an outpost here with the pawn on h4. This is very similar to the main line in the King's Gambit without even bringing the bishop. You bring your knight here to f3 and then here to g5, and then you can see very, very difficult for black to hold on control. It's even worse if they now bring their bishop to e6, because after the exchange, then the knight can take here on e6, attacking the pawn here, forking the king and the rook. There's just no good squares for black to move to. The king side's pretty weakened. The queen here on h5 is not doing anything, and none of the other material is involved into the game, and white has control of the center of the board. Also is threatening the bishop coming to f4 and capturing more material. So this is also going to be very, very good for white. The last place you may see the queen come to is f6. It does keep it very active, but white's still going to play d4. It's protected by the knight and the queen right here. But this queen is awkwardly placed. It blocks the knight coming here to f6, and it's not really threatening anything from white. Now from here, if knight to c6, same thing from white, knight to c3 right here. If instead maybe they play bishop down to g4, pinning down the knight right here, that's fine. I would still continue with knight to c3. This is not a big threat that black has right here. And then eventually, depending on where black goes, white also has some variations where if the queen's not here, you could play bishop takes on f7, check, and then the knight can come up here to g5 after the king takes here on f7. Again, can't do that right now with the queen on f6, but there are some options that white has later on in the board state. If they decide instead to play bishop to e6, go ahead and take right here. Once the pawn takes, then you could play queen to d2. This now puts both the queen and the bishop attacking this pawn here on f4. So that's what happens if they play the queen down to h4 early on. Check the king. Again, you can see from all those variations, yes, the rook never got involved into the game like typically in the main line, the King's Gambit accepted. But the king was completely safe, and white had a lot of variations where they were attacking, especially with that light square bishop. I do want to go over one variation that you will see beyond that d6, because I have seen it played quite a few times as I was testing this out, and that is the knight coming to f6. Now I call this out specifically because it could be tempting after you see knight to f6 to just push forward with e5. That is not the game plan. Other openings, absolutely, you want to be pushing, but the queen here on h4 adds a different dimension to the game because knight down to g4, putting a lot of pressure on this king side. Obviously, this is going to be checkmate down here. If white tries to stop it with queen to e1, you could have check right here. There's no good options. You take, you're going to lose the material here on h2. And you can see king can't castle, king side completely obliterated. Then you're going to see moves like bishop to c5. This is very, very bad. So if they do play knight to f6, the move is going to be knight to f3, forcing the queen back. Now if the queen comes to h6, same thing as before. D4. Also keep in mind, if they try something sneaky like knight takes on E4, now you can play queen to E2, and they're going to lose this material. Let's say knight to F5, trying to hold down this material. Okay, well, knight to C3, and they're not going to be able to stop this. You can take the knight, even if they respond, you can take that material back here on E4. Other option that you could see, if instead they play queen to H5 here, same thing, D4. Now the big difference is if they play queen takes on E4 and you play queen to E2, now they can actually defend with D5. Before they couldn't. Their queen was here on H6 and it was not defending this pawn, but now it actually is defending the material. That's fine. I would still play knight to C3. Yes, you are giving up this bishop, but if they take that bishop on C4, they're going to have a pretty difficult setup. You're going to take their knight here on E4, so they take your minor piece, you take theirs. After the king moves, you're going to take with your bishop on F4, and look at all the material you have in the center of the board. You can swing your rook over here. They have no material involved. Their queen on H5 is not doing a heck of a lot, and you have a very, very strong attack. Now, if we come back to the very beginning of the bishop's gambit, you could see knight to F6 early on instead of the queen coming out here. And I just mentioned that, yes, you typically don't want to be playing pawn up here to E5, and I would again recommend you don't play E5. I just think there's better moves that you can do in this opening. You really want to get more material involved into the game. So I would still continue with the game plan of knight to C3. Now, if they play something like D6, because this is extremely common, especially in the King's Gambit, to open up the door for the light square bishop, but also recognizing they may not have control of the center. So D6 makes a lot of sense. D4. If they play something like bishop to E7, getting rid of the castle on the king's side, this pawn here on F4 is unprotected. You can take it. You can see how different that is than if the queen is over here. It's protecting the pawn, but none of these pieces are actually defending that material. You can just take back and you have a good game. You can still castle your king on the king side since they never brought their queen down to attack that. If instead they play bishop down to G4, okay, that's fine. Knight to F3, getting ready to castle on the king side. You don't even care if they take. You can recapture with your queen, then take the pawn here on F4. You have that option as well. If instead they get their knight involved, so knight to C6, sure, go ahead and take with your bishop here on F4. Now, instead of D6, the main difference here is they can actually play D5 because the queen is still protecting this, whereas before the queen was here on H4, it was not controlling the center of the board. But if they do see this, I would go ahead and take with your knight. I don't like to lose my bishop. You can absolutely take with your bishop, but I like to keep my bishop open to attack this weakened square here on F7 later on into the game. If they go ahead and take right here, at this point, now you can go ahead and take with your bishop if you want to, since they don't have immediate threats that are attacking this right here. If we come back, let's say they decide to try something crazy, knight takes on E4, well, now you can play queen to E2. It's going to be very difficult to hold on to this knight. Now, if they play F5, you can just play D3. You're going to be taking this material right here. They can't move this knight because it's pinned down to the queen right here. They're going to lose their knight. So they can't do that. They're pretty much going to have to take the knight here on D5. Now, instead of D5, you could see the move C6. And this sets up for black pushing forward with D5. They're trying to control the center of the board, but that's our game. That's what we're trying to do. So we're just going to push forward. Say, if yeah, you could try that, but we're going to play a D4 right here. Now, if they play D5, because that's what they're setting up for, in that case, I would just go ahead and take the material. If they recapture, I would play bishop to B5 right here, check. After they play knight to C6, boom, take material here with your bishop on F4. You have a very aggressive board set. You can get your queen involved into the game. You can castle on the queen side. You can still play knight to F3, castle on the king side. So don't let them play that C6 nonsense and try to control the center. White can still control the center even if they do that. Instead of bringing their knight to f6, they could bring their knight to c6. White, same game plan, d4. What I like about the Bishop's Gambit, like some other openings, it's consistent. You don't have to memorize too many things. It's the concept of how White's trying to approach the game, trying to get all of their knights coming here to f3 or c3, then get your bishop here to f4, play d4, control the center of the board, and always be looking to attack squares like f7. Same game plan, doesn't matter where they really go to. So knight to c6, you're going to come up here to d4. If they want to now bring their queen down to h4, that's fine, check. We've been through this before. The king comes to f1. This is a similar setup as before. You can just see if they come here first, you're going to play this, and then they play knight to c6, d4. This is completely fine. Now if they play knight to f6, you already guessed it. We're going to play knight to f3 here, forcing the queen back. Maybe queen to h6, knight to c7. Very similar moves as we've seen before. If the queen doesn't come up, maybe they want to play the two knights game and get knight to f6 here. Knight to c3, no reason to play knight to f3. You don't have to force the queen away right here. So knight to c3. If they try to pin this material down, it is important to play knight to e2. You want to both attack this material as well as bring your knight here if they do decide to play bishop takes on c3. So very important to keep in mind on that one. Now, at the very beginning, they don't have to play their knights to c6 either, but there's not a lot of other options that I think are viable for black. If you see something like d6 early on, it doesn't really get any minor pieces involved into the game. I don't really like this too much from black, but you could see it. Knight to f3 here, just stopping the queen from ever coming down here, because this sets it up for me at least to castle on the king side on the next move if you want to. If they now try to pin down material, you could just play d4, controlling the center of the board. Same thing as if they play something like knight to c6. You could play d4, controlling. That's fine as well. But that is the Bishop's Gambit from the King's Gambit accepted line. So if you do like to play the King's Gambit, hopefully you do, since it's my favorite opening in chess, and you play a lot of the knight to f3, go ahead and try out the Bishop's Gambit. Let me know what you guys think. I've had a lot of fun playing it myself. But until next time, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.